The storm did not ask permission before it tore the shutters off the apothecary's window, and Elias Wren did not ask permission before he ran. He was 22, an omega with hair the color of wet sand, and eyes that had gone the soft, clouded gray of Riverstone 3 winters ago, when a fever had taken his sight and left him everything else. He could still tell morning from night by the way warmth moved across his skin. He could still tell friend from stranger by the distinct rhythm of footsteps, the way some people announced themselves in the length of their stride before they ever spoke a word. What he could not tell, apparently, was that the barn he had ducked into to escape the rain belonged to the king. The rain had come sudden and mean, the kind of autumn storm that turned the eastern road to slick black mud within minutes, and Elias had been 3 hours from home already, his satchel heavy with willow bark and dried yarrow for old Mrs. Fenwick's cough, his boots soaked through, his hands numb around the walking stick he used more for the certainty of its tap against stone than for any real support. His village, Dornbach, sat half a day's walk east of the capital, across the bridge that spanned the river Vell, near enough that a fast rider could reach it by supper, far enough that Elias had never once imagined he might stumble, quite by accident, onto royal ground. He had smelled hay and horse and warm animal breath on the wind before he'd found the barn door, and had followed that smell the way he followed most things now, gratefully and without question. Just for an hour, he told the darkness, padding along a wall of rough-hewn wood until his palm found straw, dry and sweet-smelling, stacked in a mountain against the far wall. No one keeps horses out this far from the capital, surely. The capital was, in fact, 11 minutes' walk in that exact direction, and the barn belonged to the royal stables of Falkenburg, and every single horse currently occupying it belonged to King William, 26 years old, alpha of the northern pack, ruler of a kingdom that stretched from the black pines of the Dornwald to the salt cliffs of the coast, a man who was, at that very moment, 3 stalls away, checking on a mare who'd gone into early labor. Elias burrowed into the hay like a man burrowing into a memory of safety, and within minutes, exhausted from walking 12 miles home from the eastern villages, with a satchel of medicine on his back, he was asleep. He did not hear the low, curious whine of the king's personal guard wolf, Freya, a great white she-wolf, silver-eyed, heavily pregnant, and fiercely protective of anything she decided was hers to protect, as she padded over on massive paws to investigate the strange, sweet blood scent that had wandered uninvited into her territory. He did not feel her nose against his throat, checking. He did not feel her curl her enormous round-bellied body around his, tucking him between her flank and the wall the way she would soon tuck her own pups, some ancient instinct deciding that a lost, sleeping, scentless of danger creature was hers now, whether he liked it or not. He only woke to warmth and fur and a heartbeat that was not his own, and to a voice low and startled and edged with something between alarm and complete bewilderment. Freya. A pause. Freya. What? Who is that? Elias sat up so fast he cracked his skull against a support beam, yelped and threw both arms out blindly, which resulted in one hand smacking directly into a very solid, very warm chest. "I'm so sorry," Elias began. "You're in my stable," said the chest. "Gathered that? Yes, thank you," Elias said, mortified, scrambling backward directly into Freya, who huffed at being used as a wall and did not move an inch to accommodate him. "I was caught in the storm. I didn't mean. Are you the stable master?" There was a beat of silence so profound that Elias could hear hay settling somewhere behind him. "Something like that," said the voice, and Elias would spend a great deal of time later trying to identify the exact tone that voice had used, because at the time he mistook it for amusement, and only much later understood it had been the sound of a king trying very hard not to laugh. "I'll be out of your hair immediately," Elias said, hauling himself upright, promptly stepping on Freya's tail, apologizing to Freya, and then walking directly into a support post. "I don't suppose you could point me toward the door. You're blind," the voice said, not unkindly. Simply an observation, the way one might note that it was raining, or that a wolf the size of a small pony had apparently adopted a stranger overnight. "Astute," Elias muttered, rubbing his forehead. "And you slept?" "In my stable, guarded by my pregnant wolf. I promise you I did not ask her to." "No," the voice agreed, and now there was definitely amusement in it, warm as the hand that closed, gently, around Elias's wrist to stop him from walking into a third post. "She doesn't often ask permission either. Here, the door's this way. Mind the trough." Elias let himself be steered, cataloging details the way he'd learned to since the fever. The stranger's hand was broad, calloused in the specific way of someone who trained with a sword rather than a plow, and warm, far warmer than any beta or omega Elias had ever brushed against. Only alphas ran that hot. Oh, Elias thought, with the specific dread of a man realizing he had just called a nobleman the stablemaster to his face. Oh no. You're an alpha, he said aloud, which was possibly the least useful thing he could have said. I am. You're not the stablemaster. I am not. Elias groaned and covered his face with both hands, which he immediately regretted, since it meant he could not see the king's expression, though he could hear, quite clearly, the sound of a grown man trying not to laugh and failing rather badly. His name was William. King William of Falkenburg, 26 years old, crowned 4 years prior, when his father's heart had finally given out after decades of hard winters and harder wars, alpha of the northern pack and, as Elias would learn over the following weeks, usually from someone other than William himself, since the man seemed constitutionally incapable of bragging, a rather good king if a lonely one. He had golden brown hair he kept cropped short for the sake of practicality, a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone with very strong opinions about jaws, and, Elias would come to understand, an extremely dry sense of humor that he deployed with the same precision he brought to sword work. It was Daniel, later that same week, who explained, mostly to spare Elias the indignity of asking, that in Falkenburg, as in most of the northern kingdoms, alpha, beta, and omega were simply the old words for temperament and standing, passed down through bloodlines like a family's height or the color of its eyes. No one in living memory had worn fur they weren't born with. Freya was, and had always been, exactly what she appeared to be, a wolf, entire and unremarkable in her wolfishness, no more capable of becoming a man than the king's finest stallion was, only rather more opinionated about who she let into her stable. You mean he can't turn into one of her lot? Elias said, delighted, the first time Daniel explained it. Sadly not, Daniel said. Though I understand he tried very hard to convince her he understood dogs, back when he was 12, and she remains unconvinced to this day. You were listening at the door, William said, without heat, from across the kitchen. I am always listening at the door, Daniel agreed cheerfully. It is, in fact, my primary duty as captain of the guard. You could have told me who you were, Elias said, once he'd been given a blanket, a place by the kitchen fire, and a mug of something hot that smelled like cinnamon and felt, mercifully, like it was not going to make him look any more foolish than he already had. You were rather busy walking into things, William said. I didn't want to add to your troubles. You're enjoying this. Immensely, William admitted, and Elias, despite the mortification, despite the fact that he had trespassed on royal property and been discovered curled up with the king's wolf like an accidental pup, found himself smiling, just slightly, into his mug. Elias was, that first morning, given a proper introduction to the stable itself. Once it became clear he intended to return to it. Not to sleep, William assured him rather too quickly, but because Freya had taken to following him from room to room with the devoted single-mindedness of a wolf who has decided something belongs to her, and it seemed simpler and considerably safer for the castle's furniture to let the two of them sit together where Freya was most comfortable. She's never done this before, William admitted, watching from the doorway as Elias knelt in the straw, running his hands carefully along Freya's swollen belly to feel the shift and roll of pups beneath, murmuring something too low for William to catch. Not with anyone. She barely tolerates me touching her when she's like this. She trusts easily, I think, Elias said, or she trusts strangely. I couldn't say which. I don't believe it's strange trust, William said, and there was something careful in his voice, something Elias would only understand the shape of much later. I believe she's simply better at recognizing good people than the rest of us bother to be. Introductions were made properly the next morning, once word had gotten around the castle, as word does, that the king had found a stray in the stables. Elias met them one by one, each arriving with the peculiar flurry of a person determined to inspect the stranger who had spent a night wrapped around the king's pregnant wolf. There was Daniel, the king's oldest friend and captain of the guard, a broad-shouldered beta with a booming laugh who took one look at the situation and declared, "Well, Freya has better taste in company than you do, your majesty, so I suppose we'll keep him," which made William choke on his tea. There was Robert, the king's uncle and chief adviser, a lean, silver-templed alpha with a permanently furrowed brow, who regarded Elias with the practiced suspicion of a man whose entire job was suspecting things, and who said, with painful diplomacy, "A blind Omega commoner discovered sleeping in the royal stables is not historically a situation that ends simply. It ended with breakfast," William said mildly. "I think we're managing." And there was Freya herself, who, heavily pregnant, protective, and apparently having decided overnight that Elias belonged to her pack now, planted herself against Elias's legs at every opportunity and growled, low and warning, at anyone who got too close, including, on one memorable occasion, the king himself, which resulted in William standing in his own kitchen with his hands raised in surrender to his own wolf, while Elias laughed so hard he had to sit down. Even Robert, watching from the doorway with his arms crossed, was heard to mutter that he had never in his life seen a monarch so thoroughly disarmed by an animal a third his size and temperament alone. "She likes you better than me," William said, sounding genuinely wounded. "She met me first. She's mine." "Try telling her that," Elias said, and reached down without thinking to scratch behind Freya's ears, and Freya, enormous, fearsome, universally respected Freya, melted into the touch like a much smaller dog, and William made a sound of pure betrayal that Elias would tease him about for months to come. It became, within days, something of a running joke throughout the castle. The king of Falkenburg, feared alpha of the northern pack, hero of 3 border skirmishes, thoroughly and consistently outranked in his own wolf's affections by a blind herbalist who had wandered in out of a storm. The kitchen staff took bets, quietly, on how long it would take William to admit the true reason he kept finding excuses to visit the stables each morning, and Daniel, who had, of course, placed the largest wager of anyone, made no secret of how thoroughly he intended to collect on it. He was meant to go home after a day. Then it was 3 days, because the storm had washed out the eastern bridge, and there was, Robert admitted with visible reluctance, no safe way back to Dornbach until it was repaired. Then it was a week, because Elias's grandmother, the woman who had raised him since the fever took both his sight and his parents in the same terrible winter, sent word that she had gone to stay with her sister in the hills, and would rather Elias remain somewhere warm and dry than wait alone in their small, damp cottage. And somewhere in that week, William began finding excuses to be wherever Elias was. He told himself it was courtesy. A king owed hospitality to an unexpected guest. But courtesy did not typically involve a monarch abandoning a council meeting to walk an apothecary's apprentice through the castle gardens so he could learn the layout by touch and smell. "This is rosemary. Mind the thorns just past it. That's the roses." Nor did it usually involve said monarch developing an inexplicable habit of sitting in the kitchen in the evenings, ostensibly reviewing reports, while Elias sorted dried herbs by the fire with the quick, sure hands of someone who had learned to see the world through his fingertips. "You don't need to keep me company," Elias said on the 4th such evening, not looking up from the yarrow he was separating from a tangle of chamomile. "I'm reading reports. You've been on the same page for 20 minutes. I can hear that you haven't turned it." There was a pause. "You can hear a page not turning." "I can hear a great many things, Your Majesty. It's rather the point, when the rest of you goes quiet." William set the report down. Elias heard the soft rustle of it against the table, and was silent long enough that Elias finally looked up, or the closest approximation of it, turning his face toward the sound of William's breathing. "I like the sound of your voice," William said simply, the way a man says a true thing he has been too careful to say before. "That's all. I like hearing you talk about your herbs and your grandmother, and the stupid things Daniel does when he thinks I'm not watching. I've had a great many reports read to me in this castle. I've had very few evenings where someone made me laugh." Elias felt heat climb up his throat that had nothing to do with the fire. "You could simply say you enjoy my company," he said, aiming for lightness and landing somewhere closer to breathless. "I could," William agreed. "I believe I just did. Rather badly." "Rather sweetly, actually," Elias murmured, before he could stop himself, and had the enormous satisfaction of hearing the king of Falkenburg, alpha of the northern pack, feared in 3 neighboring territories for his skill on a battlefield, make a small, strangled sound and pick his report back up, holding it, Elias was fairly certain, upside down. It was during that same week that Elias's usefulness to the castle first announced itself, quite without his meaning it to. One of the stable boys, a quiet 12-year-old named Peter, had cut his palm badly on a rusted hinge and said nothing about it for 2 days, ashamed of the fuss it might cause, until the wound had gone hot and swollen, and the boy had started shivering despite the mild weather. "Let me see," Elias said, when Daniel brought the boy to the kitchen half in a panic, having exhausted his own limited knowledge of battlefield wounds, and found this one entirely unlike any he'd stitched before. Elias's fingers found the heat of the swelling before Peter had even finished explaining, and he was already reaching for his satchel. "This needs drawing out, not stitching shut. Whoever told you to bind it tightly did you more harm than good. I'll need boiled water, clean linen, and whatever honey the kitchens can spare. Fresh, not the crystallized jars from autumn." By the time the castle physician arrived, summoned belatedly by a servant, Elias had already cleaned and dressed the wound with the brisk, unhurried competence of someone who had done this 100 times in a village, with no physician to call on at all, and Peter's fever had already begun to ease. "You might have let me handle it," the physician said, not unkindly, examining Elias's work with visible surprise. "I might have," Elias agreed. "But he was frightened, and I was already here, and I didn't think the extra half-hour of waiting would have done him any favors." William, who had come to find Elias for supper, and instead found him elbow-deep in linen and honey with a small crowd of anxious stable staff looking on, said nothing at all in that moment, but Elias heard, later, from Daniel, that the king had stood in the doorway for a full minute simply watching, with an expression Daniel described as thoroughly embarrassingly besotted, before anyone noticed him there. "I wasn't besotted," William said, when this was reported back to him over supper. "You were," Daniel said. "I have never seen a man look so proud of someone else's stitching. It wasn't even stitching. He specifically avoided stitching it. Even more impressive then." Elias, laughing into his soup, properly seasoned, this time, decided not to comment further, though he privately treasured the story for weeks afterward, glad simply to have been useful, and gladder still, though he would not have admitted it easily, to have been watched with such open fondness by a man who had every reason in the world to be careful about what he let himself want. It was Robert's idea. Technically, though he would spend the rest of his life denying any responsibility for what followed. To invite envoys from the southern territories for the autumn trade talks, and among those envoys was Charles of Merriwick, a beta merchant's son with an easy smile, excellent manners, and absolutely no sense of self-preservation whatsoever, because within an hour of his arrival he had discovered that the quiet, clever Omega who kept correcting the castle physician's dosages was unattached, unclaimed, and, in Charles's own cheerful words, criminally charming. "You must let me escort you to the herb gardens," Charles said on the second day of his visit, having maneuvered himself into the kitchen at what he clearly believed was an unobserved moment. "I hear you know every plant in them by scent alone. Remarkable. It's not remarkable, it's necessary," Elias said, amused despite himself, "though I appreciate the gallantry." "Gallantry is my specialty," Charles said, and Elias, who could not see the man's face, but could very much hear the sound of a chair scraping back with unusual violence from the doorway, did not yet understand why the temperature in the room had dropped several degrees. "Charles," said William's voice, pleasant in the specific way that a sword is pleasant right before it is unsheathed. "I wasn't aware you'd taken an interest in herbalism." "Your Majesty," Charles said, brightening, entirely unaware that he was standing in the direct path of an Alpha King's jealousy for possibly the first time in recorded Falkenburg history. "I was just telling Elias how impressed I am by his knowledge. Truly a hidden gem, this one." "He is not a gem," William said. "He is a person, with opinions. Several of them, usually about people who call him a gem." "He calls me lovely things too when he thinks I must sleep," Elias said serenely, to the pot he was stirring, and had the very great pleasure of hearing William make a noise like a man who had just been shot by his own arrow. Daniel, who had wandered in halfway through this exchange and immediately grasped the entire situation with the delight of a man who lived for exactly this sort of chaos, leaned against the doorframe and said, "Charles, my friend, I would suggest complimenting the soup instead." "The soup does smell wonderful," Charles said gamely. "The soup," William said, with the enormous dignity of a man about to say something deeply undignified, "was made by me." There was a silence. "You made soup," Elias said slowly, turning his face toward William with an expression of pure delight, For me? For the castle, William said, too quickly. Generally, as a king does. For his people, broadly. It has entirely too much rosemary in it, Elias said. I could smell it from the hallway. You said you liked rosemary. I like rosemary in reasonable quantities, William, not enough to season an entire herd of sheep. I have been informed, William said to the room at large, with the air of a man who had lost an argument he did not remember starting, that I am bad at soup. I would like it noted that I have never received this complaint before. You've never made soup before, Daniel said. You paid the kitchen to make it and lied about it once 2 years ago for the harvest feast, and everyone knew. Daniel, I'm only saying, this is a pattern of behavior. Daniel. Charles, wisely, excused himself sometime during this exchange, and returned to his own quarters that evening, having quietly concluded that whatever was happening between the King of Falkenburg and his blind herbalist houseguest was not, in fact, a situation that called for southern gallantry, and spent the remainder of his visit flirting instead, with great success, with one of the castle's beta stable hands. William did not make soup again for several weeks. When he finally did, Elias noted, with great satisfaction, that it had exactly the right amount of rosemary. You asked the kitchen for the recipe, Elias said, tasting it. I asked the kitchen for advice, William said with dignity. There's a difference, is there? There is when I'm the one saying it. The Falkenburg Harvest Festival came 3 weeks after Charles of Merowic's departure, and Elias had assumed, wrongly as it turned out, that the worst of the courtship comedy had concluded with the soup incident. He had not accounted for the fact that a kingdom's entire nobility gathered in one courtyard, fed generously on mulled wine, would produce an entirely new category of disaster. You should dance, Daniel said, appearing at Elias's elbow, with the specific cheer of a man who knew exactly what he was starting. There's a lovely tradition here, the harvest circle. Everyone takes a turn with everyone else. Very old, very important, absolutely essential to Falkenburg culture. Is it? Elias said, unconvinced. Deeply essential, Daniel confirmed. In fact, Lord Aldrich was just asking after you. Lord Aldrich, it transpired, was a young alpha lord from the western hills, recently widowed of a beta wife, handsome by all accounts, and entirely unaware that he had been selected by Daniel as the evening's chosen instrument of chaos. He approached with perfectly reasonable manners, asked Elias kindly, and without any of Charles's overeager gallantry, whether he might have the next dance, and Elias, who could hear no particular danger in the request and rather liked the idea of dancing, agreed. He did not see William's face across the courtyard. He did, however, hear the abrupt silence that fell over a cluster of guests near the king, followed by the very specific sound of a wine goblet being set down with more force than strictly necessary. He's not actually going to do anything, Robert murmured to Daniel, watching William cross the courtyard with the deliberate, unhurried gait of a man who had absolutely decided to do something. Will he? I give it 4 minutes, Daniel said happily. It took William 2. Lord Aldrich, William said, arriving at the edge of the dance with a smile that did not, Elias noted from the careful stiffness that entered Aldrich's voice, reach anything like his eyes. I wonder if I might borrow my guest for a moment, a matter of some urgency. Of course, Your Majesty, Aldrich said, releasing Elias's hand rather more quickly than courtesy strictly required, and retreating with the wise instinct of a man who had correctly identified an alpha in the grip of something he was choosing not to examine too closely. What? Elias said, delighted, as William's hand replaced Aldrich's, was the urgent matter. There wasn't one, William admitted. William. I didn't like watching that, William said, with the loose-tongued honesty of a man 3 cups of mulled wine past his usual reserve. I am aware that is unreasonable. He did nothing wrong. You are allowed to dance with whomever you please, and I have no actual claim over you, and I recognize that jealousy is an ugly thing to bring to a harvest festival, and yet here I am, having brought it anyway, rather loudly, in front of several visiting lords. You could simply ask me to dance instead, Elias pointed out, biting back a laugh, rather than diplomatically kidnapping me mid-song. I am aware of that too, William said with great dignity, and then, considerably less steadily, Elias, will you dance with me? I would love to, Elias said, though I should warn you, I can't see the steps, so you'll need to guide me, and if you let me walk into anything in front of the entire Western nobility, I will never let you live it down. I would sooner let the Western nobility fall into a ditch than let you stumble, William said, drawing him close, one hand warm at the small of his back, the other folded securely around Elias's, and guided him through the harvest circle with a care so total that Elias, who had braced for missteps and collisions, found himself instead simply moving, trusting the small shifts of William's hands to tell him where to turn, when to sway, how close to stand. "You're better at this than the soup," Elias murmured, close enough now that only William could hear him. "I have had considerably more practice not ruining you than I've had not ruining broth," William said, and Elias laughed against his shoulder, loud enough that half the courtyard turned to look, and Daniel, watching from the sidelines with Robert, both men now several coins richer or poorer depending on which side of the 4-minute wager they'd landed on, raised his goblet in a silent, satisfied toast to a job well and thoroughly done. It happened on an ordinary evening, which Elias would later think was fitting, since nothing about William's affection had ever announced itself with fanfare. It had simply accumulated, the way warmth accumulates near a hearth, until one day you realize you have been comfortable for so long you no longer remember what cold felt like. They were in the garden, where William had taken to walking with him most evenings, narrating the sky the way Elias narrated the plants. "There's a hawk circling near the east tower, and the clouds are doing that thing you said, looks like carded wool," when Elias, without quite meaning to, reached out and found William's hand in the dark and simply held it. William went very still. "Is this all right?" Elias asked, suddenly uncertain, already beginning to pull back. William's fingers closed around his before he could. "It is considerably more than all right," he said, and his voice had gone rough in a way Elias had learned over the past weeks to recognize as meaning something. "Elias, I have spent 4 years being a king first and a person somewhere far down the list after that. I did not expect." He stopped, started again. "I did not expect to find someone who made me want to be a person again. And then a wolf found you sleeping in my hay and decided you belonged to her. And I confess I have felt rather similarly ever since, though with considerably less claim to the sentiment, since she met you first and I am apparently required to share." Elias laughed, startled and warm, and lifted his free hand to find William's face, tracing it the way he traced everything he wished to know, the line of his jaw, the furrow between his brows that Elias had learned appeared when William was nervous, the corner of his mouth, currently curved into something soft. "I can't see you," Elias said quietly. "I want you to know that, whatever this is, I'll never see your face the way others do. I won't see you grow older, or see whatever expression you're making right now. You see quite a lot more than most people manage with 2 working eyes," William said, and turned his face into Elias's palm, pressing a kiss there that Elias felt all the way to his ribs. "I would rather be known by your hands than merely looked at by anyone else's." That, Elias said, a little unsteadily, was unfairly well said, for a man who ruined an entire pot of soup with rosemary. "I contain multitudes," William said, and kissed him, carefully, questioningly, one hand coming up to rest against the curve of Elias's jaw, as though he were something to be handled with the same reverence Elias gave his herbs. And Elias, who had spent 3 years learning to read the world through touch alone, decided this was, without question, the finest thing his hands had ever helped him understand. Somewhere nearby, Freya, heavily pregnant and utterly unbothered by romance, gave a single satisfied huff as though she had known this outcome weeks ago and was simply waiting for the 2 idiots in question to catch up. It was not, Elias reflected later, that he had expected any of this. Not the castle, not the king, not the dizzying feeling of being wanted by someone who never once treated his blindness as a lack to be pitied. He had built his whole life, since the fever, around careful expectations kept deliberately small. A cottage he knew by heart, a garden of herbs whose every leaf he could name by scent, a grandmother's steady voice reading him letters by the fire. He had not expected warmth this large, or this loud, or this inclined toward terrible jokes at inconvenient moments. He told William as much one evening, sorting dried lavender into muslin sachets while William read, properly, this time, through a stack of border reports. "I used to think I'd made my peace with a small life," Elias said. "Not an unhappy one, just small. A village, a garden, patients who needed tending. I didn't think there was room in it for anything grander, and now I think I simply hadn't met the right kind of grand yet," Elias said. "I always imagined grandness as noise, parades, crowns, that sort of thing. I didn't expect it to feel like this, like someone remembering, every single day, that I take my tea with too much honey and not enough patience for waiting. You take your tea like you're personally offended by the concept of moderation, William said, setting his reports aside entirely now. It's one of my favorite things about you. You have a great many favorite things about me. I begin to suspect you're simply making the list up as you go. I assure you the list is extensive and entirely genuine, William said. Shall I recite it? Please don't. I'll never get these sachets finished. Later then, William said, satisfied, as though it were a promise rather than a threat, and Elias, smiling down at his lavender, warm from the fire, and warmer still from something that had nothing to do with flame, found he did not mind the promise in the slightest. It could not, of course, remain simple, because Robert, who loved his nephew fiercely, in the tight-lipped, worrying way of a man who had watched his brother die and had appointed himself guardian of everything that could go wrong afterward, called a private council the very next morning. A commoner, Robert said, pacing, blind, no pack affiliation, no political alliances, no. Say the word gem, and I will have you thrown in the moat, William said pleasantly. I wasn't going to say gem. You were building to something worse. I was going to say no protection, Robert snapped. William, you cannot simply. The southern lords already whisper that you're too soft since the treaty with Verholt. If you take an unclaimed Omega commoner as a consort with no dowry, no land, no. He has knowledge of healing that has already saved 3 stable hands from infection this season alone, William said, and his voice had dropped into something Elias, listening from the hallway, where he had not quite meant to be eavesdropping, but had also not quite managed to leave. Recognized as the king's actual ruling voice, the one that ended council arguments, he corrected the castle physician's treatment of the miller's daughter, and likely saved her leg. He has more genuine care for this kingdom's people in a single afternoon than half the southern lords manage in a year. I don't care what he lacks in land, Robert. I care what he has, which is more than most people bring to a crown, and if the southern lords rebel over it, then I will remind them, William said, that I did not become alpha of this pack by being soft whatever they whisper, and that a king who chooses his heart over his ledgers is not the same thing as a king who cannot fight for either. There was a long silence. You truly love him, Robert said, and it was not quite a question anymore. I truly do, William said. I'm aware it's inconvenient. I find I don't much care. Elias, in the hallway, pressed a hand over his own mouth to keep from making a sound, and it was Daniel. Of course it was Daniel, who had an uncanny ability to appear at exactly the moment his presence would cause maximum chaos, who found him there a moment later, wiping his eyes, and said, far too loudly, Ah, Elias! Lovely morning for lurking outside council chambers, isn't it? Which resulted in Elias being dragged, mortified, into the council room by an unrepentant Daniel while Robert sputtered, and William turned the exact color of the roses in his own garden. You heard all of that, William said. Most of it, Elias admitted. I meant every word. I gathered, Elias said, and reached for his hand, and Robert, silver-templed, endlessly pragmatic Robert, sighed the sigh of a man who knew a losing argument when he heard one, and said, with as much grace as he could muster, Well, I suppose I ought to begin drafting a formal courtship announcement then, before the southern lords hear a worse version of this story than the truth. Freya had given birth on a quiet night some 6 weeks after the harvest festival, 4 pups, silver-eyed and white-furred like their mother, born in the very stable where she'd first curled around Elias during the storm, with Elias himself, summoned by an anxious William at midnight, kneeling in the straw to murmur reassurances she seemed, if anything, faintly insulted to need. By the turn of winter, the pups were sturdy enough underfoot to trip half the kitchen staff at least once a week, and Freya herself had settled back into her old watchfulness, matronly now, patient in the unhurried way of a mother who has decided her children's chaos is simply the price of love. The trouble began, as trouble in Falkenburg so often did, with Elias insisting he was perfectly capable of gathering winter herbs from the edge of the Dornwald without an escort, and William insisting, with equal stubbornness, that he would be accompanying him regardless of what Elias thought about his own capability. I have walked that tree line 100 times, Elias said, tying his satchel closed with brisk, practiced movements, long before I ever met you. I know every root and rise of that path better than most sighted men know their own gardens. I don't doubt your knowledge of the path, William said. I doubt the wolves that have been reported near the northern border this month. There's a difference between knowing a road and knowing what's currently walking on it. In the end, Elias went, and William went with him, and Freya, her pups old enough now to be left for an afternoon under Daniel's dubious supervision, insisted on coming too, padding ahead of them with her nose low to the frost-crusted ground. It was Freya who caught the scent first. Not wolf, but something colder and more deliberate, the distinct sourness of men who had gone too long without washing and had oiled their blades recently enough that the smell still clung. She went rigid, hackles lifting, and let out a single loud growl that stopped both men in their tracks. "Bandits," William said quietly, already moving Elias behind him with one arm, the other hand dropping to the short blade he carried out of habit rather than expectation. "Elias, stay close to Freya. Whatever happens, do not let go of her, William." "I need you safe more than I need you brave right now," William said, low and urgent, and Elias, who had spent a lifetime being underestimated, who hated more than almost anything the specific helplessness of not being able to see a threat coming, swallowed his protest and pressed a hand into Freya's thick ruff instead, letting her guide him back against the broad trunk of an old beech tree. There were 3 of them, it turned out, desperate men from a failed harvest further south, more frightened than dangerous, more interested in William's fine winter cloak and the coin purse at his belt than in any real violence, and it was over faster than Elias's racing heart quite believed. The scrape of steel, a shout, the heavy thud of a body meeting frozen ground, and then William's voice, breathless but whole, calling his name. "I'm here," Elias said, already moving toward the sound, Freya close at his side. "I'm all right. Are you hurt?" "A scratch," William said, and Elias's hands found him in the dark of his own blindness and did not believe him, tracing along his arm until they found the torn sleeve, the warm slick of blood beneath it, and Elias's breath caught in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "You're bleeding! It's shallow, William." "I promise you," William said, and there was something almost laughing in his voice despite the tremor beneath it, the giddy relief of a man who has just realized how badly a moment could have gone and did not. "I have had considerably worse from Daniel's sparring matches. Elias, look at me. I know you can't. I'm sorry, that isn't. I only mean I am well. I am here. You are here. That is the whole of what matters." Elias, hands still pressed to the wound, found he was shaking, and it was William who gathered him close then, blood and cold and all, murmuring something low against his hair, while Freya pressed her considerable weight against both their legs, as though she, too, needed the reassurance of contact. "I have spent my whole life being told what I cannot do because I cannot see," Elias said, muffled against William's chest, once his hands had stopped trembling enough to bind the wound properly with strips torn from his own cloak. "I have never once, in all that time, been so afraid of what I could have lost." "You won't lose it," William said. "Not while I have any say in the matter, which, as it happens, I have quite a lot of, being the king and so forth." "That was a terrible joke," Elias said, half a laugh escaping despite the tears still clinging to his lashes. "I am aware. I am attempting to make you laugh instead of cry, and finding my usual material rather limited by the circumstance of having recently been stabbed. It's a scratch, you said." "A scratch that involved a knife," William allowed, "which I understand is a technicality you are not required to forgive me for." They walked home slower than they'd walked out, William's good arm around Elias's shoulders more for his own comfort than for guidance, Freya trotting a careful, watchful circle around them the whole way. And it was that night, once the castle physician had properly cleaned and stitched the wound and pronounced William likely to survive his own recklessness, that Elias climbed into the bed beside him without being asked and simply held on, and neither of them mentioned, in the morning, how tightly they had both slept. The trouble, when it came from an unexpected direction, not the southern lords, who grumbled but ultimately valued peace over pride, but from a distant cousin of William's, a beta lord named Edmund, who had quietly hoped, for several years, that William's lack of an heir might eventually redirect the succession toward his own branch of the family, and who did not take kindly to the sudden public courtship of an Omega who might yet produce one. Edmund arrived at court under the guise of a courtesy visit, all smooth words and careful compliment Elias, who had learned, over the past months, to read intention in the texture of a voice the way sighted people read it in a face, disliked him within the first 5 minutes, though he could not have said precisely why until later. "You must forgive my caution," Edmund said to him, over a dinner Elias would rather not have attended, but surely you understand the concern. A kingdom's stability resting on the whims of the heart rather than the certainties of bloodline and land. I mean no offense, of course, merely an observer's honesty. "None taken," Elias said pleasantly, though his grip on his wine cup had tightened considerably, though I'd note that stability built on fear of change tends to crumble rather faster than stability built on people who are simply well cared for. Falkenburg's granaries were half empty 3 winters ago, before William changed the tax structure on the northern farms. I don't recall bloodline having much to do with that success. Edmund's smile thinned. "How very informed you are for a village herbalist." "I read a great deal," Elias said. "Someone reads it to me, at any rate. It turns out information doesn't much care whether you take it in through your eyes or your ears." "A charming answer," Edmund said, though his tone had cooled considerably. "Tell me, does it not trouble you, marrying into a life you cannot fully see? The portraits in the great hall, the maps of the kingdom you'll one day help rule, the face of your own husband across the breakfast table, all of it lost to you. I only ask out of concern. It seems a great deal to give up love for." The table went very still. Robert set down his fork. Even Daniel, who rarely missed an opportunity to fill silence, said nothing at all. "I haven't given anything up," Elias said, and though his voice stayed even, there was steel beneath it now, the particular calm of a man who had been asked some version of this question his whole life and had long since stopped flinching from it. "I know the shape of William's face better than most sighted men know their own reflections. I've traced every line of it with my own hands, which is more honesty than most portraits offer. I know this kingdom by the sound of its market days, and the smell of its harvests, and the names its people say with gratitude when they think no one important is listening. I haven't lost a single thing worth having, Lord Edmund. I've simply learned to hold it differently than you would." William, at the head of the table, had gone very quiet in the specific way that meant he was cataloguing every word for later, and it was that quiet, careful attention, rather than any dramatic confrontation, that undid Edmund's scheme in the end. Within the week, the rumor began. Whispers among the servants that Elias had bewitched the king with herbal tricks, that no true alpha would fall for a blind commoner without some manner of trickery involved, that the whole courtship was built on charms and potions, rather than anything so mundane as affection freely given. Edmund's attempt at sabotage was clumsy, the sort of rumor that might have done real damage in a kingdom less accustomed to William's steadiness, but it collided instead with the immovable fact that half the castle staff had personally watched Elias nurse their children and co-workers back to health with nothing more magical than willow bark and patience, and the rumor withered within a week, helped along considerably by Daniel, who took a rather gleeful personal interest in tracking the story back to its source. It traced to Edmund's own manservant, Daniel reported at dinner some days later, with the tone of a man delivering the best news of his life. "Paid 2 silver coins to start the whispering in the kitchens." 2. For a rumor this ambitious, I'd have expected at least 5. "Should I feel guilty?" Elias asked. "Absolutely not," William said. "You've done nothing but exist and be wonderful, which is apparently intolerable to certain people. That's their failing, not yours. He called me a bewitching commoner," Elias said thoughtfully. "I rather liked bewitching." "I'll have it embroidered on something," William said, as a formal title just to spite him, and Elias laughed so hard he nearly upended his own wine, and Freya, curled beneath the table with her now-grown pups tumbling over Elias's feet in a warm, squirming pile, gave a low, contented sound, as though she too found the entire matter thoroughly settled. Edmund himself fled to his estate in the hills, rather than face Robert's pointed, meticulous questions about where precisely 2 silver coins and a rumor had originated, and was not seen at court again for the better part of a year, a fact which Robert, who had grown fonder of Elias with each passing month despite his initial misgivings, brought up with visible satisfaction at every opportunity thereafter. Elias's grandmother came to the castle for the first time in early winter, summoned gently by William himself, who had written to her, or rather, dictated a letter to Robert, since his own handwriting was reportedly abysmal, asking whether she might visit before he did anything so significant as ask her grandson to marry him. You didn't have to ask her permission. Elias said, mortified and touched in equal measure, once he'd learned of the letter. "I'm a grown man. I make my own choices." "I know that," William said. "I wasn't asking her permission. I was asking for her blessing, which is a different thing entirely, and one I wanted regardless of whether tradition required it. She raised you after you lost your parents and your sight in the same terrible winter. She deserves to know the man asking to marry you understands the weight of what he's asking to be given." Elias's grandmother, a small, sharp-eyed woman named Margaret, with a laugh like a creaking gate, and absolutely no patience for royal formality, arrived, took one look at the arrangement of the castle's guest quarters, declared it entirely too much fuss for an old woman who slept in barns, and then spent the better part of an hour interrogating William with a directness that left even Robert faintly impressed. "You understand he sees more than most people manage," she said over tea, "even without his eyes. Don't you dare think you're marrying someone who needs protecting from the world. He's spent 3 years learning to walk through it better than most sighted fools I've met." "I am aware," William said. "I believe it's one of the things I love most about him. I have no intention of protecting him from a world he's already mastered, only of standing beside him in it, if he'll have me." Margaret studied him for a long moment, the measuring silence of a woman who had buried a son and raised his blind child alone, and had earned, several times over, the right to be careful about who she trusted with what remained of her family. "Well," she said finally, patting William's hand with surprising fondness, "you'll do. Try not to ruin the soup at the wedding feast, if you can manage it. I hear that's rather a specialty of yours." "Word travels," William said, wounded, and Margaret cackled, and later that evening told Elias privately that she had rarely seen a man look at another person the way William looked at him, like a man who had spent years cataloging loss and had finally, unexpectedly, found something worth building toward instead. The proposal itself came a week later, in the herb garden at dusk, which Elias would later think was exactly right, since it was the one place in the entire castle that had become, over the past year, unmistakably his, every plant catalogued by scent and touch, every path memorized by the familiar crunch of gravel beneath his boots. "I had a whole speech prepared," William admitted, and Elias could hear, for once, real nervousness beneath the words, the telltale unsteadiness of a king who had faced down bandits and hostile councils without flinching and found himself, now, entirely undone by the prospect of a single question. "Daniel helped me write it. It had several very good lines about rosemary. I'd like to hear the rosemary lines," Elias said, smiling. "I've forgotten every one of them," William confessed. "I only remember that I love you, that I have loved you since a storm brought you into my stable and my own wolf decided, before I had the sense to admit it myself, that you belonged with us, that I would like very much to spend the rest of my life learning new ways to love you badly and sincerely, the way I apparently love making soup. Elias Wren, will you marry me?" Elias, laughing and crying in roughly equal measure, reached for his hands and found them already offered, a small velvet box pressed into his palms, and inside it, when his fingers traced the shape, a ring set not with a smooth stone, but with one carefully, deliberately textured, ridged and patterned, so that he might know its beauty by touch as surely as anyone else might know it by sight. "You had it made specially," Elias said, throat tight. "I wanted you to be able to feel it," William said simply. "Every part of it. I didn't want anything about this, about us, to require eyes you don't have. I want you to know I chose this ring the way I chose you. Completely. On purpose. With every intention of it last. Yes," Elias said, before William had even properly finished, laughing at his own eagerness. "Yes, William, obviously yes. I hadn't actually gotten to asking a second time to make sure." "You asked perfectly well the first time," Elias said, and kissed him, there among the roses and the rosemary, while Freya, alert and watchful as ever beneath the hedges, gave a single satisfied huff, as though she had known this outcome from the very first night, and was simply, finally pleased to see the rest of them catch up to her. They were married in the spring, when the castle gardens Elias knew so well by touch had come fully into bloom, and William, who had asked, with uncharacteristic nervousness, whether Elias would prefer the ceremony held somewhere he could navigate without assistance, arranged for the entire event to take place among the roses and rosemary hedges Elias had learned by heart over the past year, so that he would need no one's hand to guide him down the aisle, only the familiar, beloved geography of a place that had become, without his quite noticing when, home. The morning of the wedding, Margaret fussed over Elias's collar with the fierce insistence of a woman determined not to cry before the ceremony had even begun, and failed entirely. And Elias, hearing the thickness in her voice, reached blindly for her hand and held it a long moment before either of them could speak. "Your father would have been unbearable today," she said finally, voice rough, insufferable with pride. "He'd have told every stranger in the kingdom that his boy was marrying a king, whether they asked or not. I wish he could have met him," Elias said quietly. "He'd have liked him," Margaret said, terrible soup notwithstanding. The ceremony itself passed for Elias in a warm blur of sound and scent. The low murmur of gathered guests, the sweet perfume of the roses, William had chosen precisely because Elias loved them. Daniel's booming voice attempting, and failing, to whisper something to Robert about the betting odds on William's composure, and beneath it all, William's voice when it came time for vows, steady at first and then unmistakably breaking. "I do," William said, and then, more quietly, meant only for Elias, though the whole garden heard it anyway. "I would say it 100 times more if the priest allowed it." And Elias, laughing through tears of his own now, said his own vows back with a steadiness he had not expected to find, because for the first time in longer than he could remember, there was nothing uncertain left to be afraid of. The feast afterward stretched long into the evening, full of the particular noise of a kingdom determined to celebrate properly, fiddles and laughter, the clink of raised cups, Robert making a toast so uncharacteristically sentimental that Daniel loudly demanded he repeat it so everyone could be sure they'd heard correctly, and Freya, resplendent in a garland of late roses that Elias had woven himself, and insisted she wear, despite William's protests, that no self-respecting guard wolf ought to be seen in flowers, holding court by the head table as though the entire event had been arranged for her benefit alone. "She does look rather pleased with herself," Elias observed, having been given a full report by Daniel, who had appointed himself Elias's eyes for the evening with unusual seriousness. "She's wearing the flowers like a crown," Daniel confirmed. "I believe she considers this her wedding as much as yours. Given that she's the one who actually chose you, I can't say she's entirely wrong to think so." "You didn't have to do that," Elias murmured as they stood together afterward, the last of the wedding guests, dispersing into the golden evening light, Freya's now grown pups chasing each other in delighted circles around the fountain. "I wanted you to walk into this on your own terms," William said. "You've spent your whole life being underestimated by people who assumed your blindness meant helplessness. I refuse to be one more person who does that to you. Not on the day you agreed to marry me. Not ever. You are," Elias said, turning his face up toward him, "unfairly good at saying things that make me want to cry in front of an entire kingdom." "I've had a great deal of practice being unfairly good at things," William said, entirely too pleased with himself, and kissed him, soft and sure, and smelling of rosemary and roses, and the steady warmth that Elias had, somewhere in the last year, stopped associating with strangers, and started associating simply entirely with the word home. Somewhere behind them, Daniel could be heard loudly informing Robert that he owed him money on a bet regarding how long it would take William to cry during the vows. 4 seconds, apparently, which Robert disputed as unsportsmanlike given that William had also cried during the rehearsal, and Charles of Merriwick, who had traveled back for the occasion with his new beta husband in tow, raised a glass and declared, to no one in particular, that Falkenburg soup had markedly improved this past year, which William chose, magnanimously, to take as a wedding gift. Epilogue, a year later and considerably less soup. "You put too much rosemary in it again," Elias said, without turning from the herb rack he was restocking in the castle's private kitchen, a habit he had never quite given up, king's consort or not, since sorting herbs by feel still felt like the truest kind of peace he knew. "I did not," William said from the stove, in the tone a man who absolutely had. "William, it's a generous amount of rosemary. It's the entire jar. I can hear how empty it is when you set it down." There was a long, guilty silence, punctuated by the specific rustle of a king attempting to quietly measure salt into a pot to compensate, and Elias, a full year into marriage, and no less delighted by these small domestic disasters than he had been the first time he'd caught William lying about soup in front of a southern envoy, bit back a laugh and let him have the small dignity of thinking he'd gotten away with it. It was a good life, the one they'd built together in the year since the wedding. Robert had softened slowly into something almost fond, having discovered that Elias's careful management of the castle's medicinal stores had saved the treasury a genuinely embarrassing sum of money, a fact he brought up at every possible opportunity as though it retroactively justified his own initial objections. Daniel had never once stopped finding new ways to embarrass William in front of guests, a hobby he pursued with the dedication of a man who considered it a sacred duty. Freya had claimed a permanent spot by the kitchen fire, a little slower to rise than she used to be, but every bit as watchful, dozing most days surrounded by whichever of her grown pups happened to be visiting, and still, on occasion, growled warningly at William if she felt he was taking too long to bring Elias his tea. There had been a small crisis, only the week prior, when one of Freya's pups, a boisterous, silver-eyed young male the kitchen staff had taken to calling Biscuit, over William's strenuous objections that a former Royal Guard wolf's offspring deserved a more dignified name, had discovered he could open the pantry latch with his nose, and had proceeded to distribute an entire wheel of cheese across the kitchen floor with the calm satisfaction of a job well done. Elias had laughed so hard at the ensuing chaos, William attempting to herd a very unrepentant wolf out from under the table, while Freya watched the whole affair with what could only be described as maternal pride, that he'd had to sit down on the floor entirely, still laughing, while William informed him, with great betrayal, that he had married a man who found his own suffering hilarious. "You looked ridiculous," Elias said, still grinning, once the cheese had been salvaged and Biscuit banished, temporarily and without any real remorse on either side, to the courtyard. "I could hear it in your voice. You'll forgive me for finding it funny. I could have used support, solidarity, a husband's loyalty. You had my loyalty. I loyally did not get up to help, out of great respect for how well you were managing on your own. You are the worst consort in the history of Falkenburg." "I'm the only consort in the history of Falkenburg," Elias pointed out, "which makes me, by simple mathematics, also the best." Margaret visited twice a season now, always declaring the castle too grand by half, and always staying a week longer than she'd originally planned, delighted in equal measure by the castle's gardens, and by the endless, gentle opportunities to remind William that she had known him only a year less than his own mother's memory, and was therefore entitled to an old woman's full honesty about his cooking. "Still too much rosemary," she announced, on her most recent visit, after a single spoonful. "I have been improving," William said, with the wounded dignity of a man who had, in fact, been practicing in secret. "You have been improving from catastrophic to merely bad," Margaret said, patting his cheek fondly. "Progress is progress. I raised a blind grandson who reads plants by their smell better than most physicians read their books by sight. I know what real progress looks like, and this, my dear boy, is not quite it yet." Elias, listening to William splutter some reply about royal dignity and the unfairness of being critiqued in his own kitchen by his own grandmother-in-law, found himself laughing so hard he had to set down the mortar and pestle he'd been grinding chamomile in, steadying himself against the table while Freya, roused by the noise, thumped her tail once against the floor in placid agreement with whichever side of the argument amused her more. They had decided, quietly and without any drama at all, that children were not a thing they needed to make this complete. Falkenburg's succession would pass, eventually and happily, to one of Daniel's numerous nephews, a fact Daniel treated with the solemn gravity of a man announcing he'd personally won a war. What Elias and William had instead was this: mornings that began with William narrating the color of the sky before Elias had even fully woken, because he'd learned Elias liked to know what kind of day was waiting. Evenings that ended in the garden among the roses, William's hand finding his without either of them needing to reach very far anymore. A home filled with terrible soup and worse jokes, and a wolf who had decided, on one stormy night over a year ago, that a stranger sleeping in the hay belonged to her pack, and had turned out, against every reasonable expectation, to be entirely right. "I love you," William said, apropos of nothing, setting the ruined soup aside in favor of simply crossing the kitchen and wrapping his arms around Elias from behind, chin resting against his shoulder. "I don't believe I say it enough. I love you a genuinely inconvenient amount, for a king who is meant to be composed at all times." "You say it every day," Elias said, leaning back into him, smiling. usually right before confessing to a soup-related crime, so I've learned to be suspicious of the timing. Can it not simply be true and well-timed? It can, Elias allowed, turning in his arms to find William's mouth with the unerring accuracy of long practice. Be both. I love you too. Inconveniently, constantly, regardless of the soup. I'm going to have that put on a plaque, William murmured against his lips. Please don't, regardless of the soup, by order of the king, William. It has a nice ring to it. Elias kissed him quiet, which was, by that point, a very well-practiced and entirely effective method of winning any argument between them. Outside the kitchen window, the Falkenburg spring turned the rose gardens gold, the same roses that had witnessed a proposal, a wedding, and 100 smaller, quieter promises exchanged in between, and Freya slept on by the fire, entirely undisturbed, exactly where she'd decided, a long time ago, that her whole strange, beloved, accidental family belonged. Somewhere above the castle, the bells that had rung for their wedding still hung silent in the tower, waiting patiently for the next occasion worth marking, and neither Elias nor William much minded that they had no particular plans to give it one any time soon. They had, after all, everything they needed already, gathered close around one kitchen fire, soup and all.